Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters, and today I have a very special video that was very long in my backlog needed to be made, and we're going to be tackling today the subject of Crimea, and specifically talking about Crimean Tatars. Today I have Leah, Ukrainian Crimean Tatar activist that is now spreading the word about the difficult situation that Crimean Tatars are in, and I want to give the platform for her to spread that information because I know you have been asking my viewers, have been asking to get a little bit more understanding about specifics of Crimea, understanding what is the population there, and specifically Crimean Tatar perspective. So, with this said, I want to give the floor to Leah to introduce herself, and we're gonna kick it off with the questions after. Oh yeah, and the video and the sound from me is gonna be terrible. I'm still traveling, but thankfully I will not be talking a lot.
Okay, hey everyone, my name is Leah. I'm a Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian activist. I was born in Crimea, but I was forced to leave my home in 2014 due to the Russian occupation. And currently, I'm spreading the culture and history of Crimean Tatars and Crimea among Ukrainians and international community.
Thank you for that short intro. And my first question to kind of kick off the discussion to understand, would you be able to talk about Crimean Tatar people in general? What is it? How are they historically appeared in Crimea? What is the difference between the historical perspectives when it was the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union, and what's the shape of the community right now with the Russian occupation of the peninsula? Just to get people to understand the situation you're in.
Okay, so Crimean Tatars are the indigenous people of Crimea. We were formed in Crimea from many nations that live there at different times and different historical periods. And Crimea was annexed by Russia for the first time in 1783. At that time, 90% of the population were Crimean Tatars. But after the occupation of Crimea by the Russians, the demographic situation in Crimea began to change, and Russians have become the majority. Meanwhile, Crimean Tatars a minority in their historical land. It happened because Russia continually forced them to immigrate to other countries, and in 1944 they deported 200,000 of the people to the Central Asia without the right to return, including my family. So the Crimean Tatars are carriers of a common historical experience, a collective trauma of deportation in which the vision of Russia as a colonizer is rooted. This is why the Crimean Tatars did not support the occupation of Crimea in 2014.
But how is the life for Crimean Tatars right now under the occupation?
Over the past 9 years, many Crimean Tatars were persecuted and repressed for their pro Ukrainian views because our very existence in Crimea contradicts the Russian myth of Crimeans who want to be with Russia. And the situation has worsened since the beginning of the full scale war. Arrests, kidnappings of activists, searches in the houses of Crimean Tatars, the banning of our language, deportations, and tortures. This is the reality of today's Crimea. Like, for example, Nariman Jalal, an indigenous rights defender and the first deputy head of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, was sentenced to 17 years in prison for participating in the Crimean platform and for condemning the Russian regime. Also, the Russians arrested a Crimean Tatar woman, Linia Umerova, because she refused Russian passport. This is just some of many cases.
Yeah, I think it's what you describe. I think it's something that people just don't talk a lot enough. One of the things that mentioned was by Kaya Kallas, where she was describing the different types of peace that people can have, like after the Second World War, when there was peace in Great Britain, which led to prosperity. In the UK, was prosperity where people were free. And then there was supposedly peace in the Soviet times, but it was dealing with repression from the Soviet regime. And I think this is very actual also for this situation with the war, where people say, well, it's going to be peace if the war just stops, if the people stop shooting. But I think you are making a strong case why, if Russia just stays in charge and keeps the occupied territories, including Crimea, then it's not going to be a very nice place to be in, would it be? And
Yeah,
that brings
because
me.
Russians
I'm
they
sorry.
want. Yeah, because Russians they even now they want to destroy our nation, Crimean Tatars, because we are the indigenous people of Crimea.
Yeah, and this brings me to an interesting question that was asked a little bit around. What actually also asked by some people that know certain people in Ukraine. So while people understand situation in Ukraine, they not completely grasp the understanding what is the relationship between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, with Ukrainian governance being over the last 20 years. Some people are looking back in that history and saying, well, Crimea was almost abandoned in its governance under Ukraine, whereas others are saying, no, they were it was actually quite a nice time where people had certain freedoms. So can you a little bit explain about what was the relationships both during the previous times with Ukrainian state that had their own turbulences, and what's the situation right now?
So since 2014, the Ukrainian authorities have been raising awareness of the issue of human rights in Crimea on the international stage. In particular, several resolutions were adopted in the European Parliament and the Council of Europe condemning human rights violation against the Crimean Tatars. Um, and for example, on March of 2021, the president of Ukraine approved the strategy for deoccupation and reintegration of the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which consists in preservation of the cultural heritage of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people, preservation and development of the Crimean Tatar language, restoration of historical toponyms of the Crimean Peninsula, and raise awareness of Ukrainians about the indigenous people of Crimea, and involving the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people to the international events related with the occupied Crimea. Um, Also, Ukraine took measures to preserve the Crimean Tatar identity by creating a concept for development of Crimean Tatar language until 2032. Um, and in general, now Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, we are united in the face of the Russian aggression because we have a common enemy, which is Russia. We have a common goal, the liberation of all our territories from the occupiers. And we have one country, Ukraine, where we will live together after our victory.
That is very nice to hear. And actually, you preceded a question, so I'm going to jump a little bit, maybe the queue. But what do you see after victory of Ukrainian comes? How do you think Crimean Tatar will look at the situation? Would they want Crimea as the region to be autonomous as it was before, or it would be more unified with Ukrainian state? How would you see that future? What is the kind of narratives that are within the Crimean Tatars?
I think that Crimean Tatar national territorial autonomy should be introduced in Crimea after the deoccupation, which is based on the right of indigenous people of to self determination, like not just the autonomy of Crimea, but national territorial autonomy. So I think that for the nation that lost almost half of its population as a result of genocide and repression, it's a matter of survival as a nation. And this autonomy will guarantee the political representation of the indigenous people at the national level, cultural development, and the preservation of the Crimean Tatar identity.
Yeah, in Latvia, we also struggle with certain regional questions with regards to, and which is quite funny because Latvia is such a small state. But we definitely understand where about the protective nature of smaller languages and smaller cultures, such as like Latvian culture, where basically just over a million purely Latvians and so on. And it's something that we always very carefully look at whenever there is a question with regards how do we preserve our culture going forward so it doesn't disappear. Obviously, not the same situation because we have a state, but definitely self governance helps a lot in preservation and spreading of the individual culture. So I see the point being there.
Yeah.
What what I'm interested in is if we're going into that, you mentioned that there was an occupation that happened during the Soviet times. You mentioned that there was quite hard times. How did Crimean Tatars manage to preserve the culture despite the deportations and so on? How come you didn't get crucified or anything else? How do you keep track of that identity? Do you have any specific rituals? Like, what do you do? Can you talk about a little bit for people? What is it like?
Actually, this is a miracle that Crimean Tatars could preserve their identity and that they carried this dream to return to Crimea from generation to generation. Um, like, um, I don't know what is the secret. Like, I think Crimean Tatars were Russified in some point because, for example, I can't speak the Crimean Tatar language, my native language, as my grandparents. So this is why I'm learning this language right now, and this is the biggest problem we have in right now in Crimea, like among Crimean Tatars. Like our nation, we just try to fight all the time the Russification, and we fought to return to Crimea to preserve and to develop our culture, language.
So you speak. Is there a specific language you speak which is different from Ukrainian?
Yes, yes, Crimean Tatars, they have their own language, which is Crimean Tatar language. It's the language of Crimea.
Is it only spoken in Crimea?
Yes, yes.
But is it mutually intelligible with some of the other languages?
Hmm?
Like, can you understand? I would assume it's some sort of a Turkic language.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah.
Turkish.
Was it is it mutually intelligible with the Turkish or other parts?
Yes, yes, we can understand at some point Turkish people, but also like we are a small nation, but we have three dialects of Crimean Tatar language.
Oh wow!
Yes, because also Crimean Tatars, they have three sub-ethnic groups, which is Nohai Crimean Tatars, uh, Tatlar Crimean Tatars, and Yalıboylu. So all of these three sub-ethnic groups, they have their own dialects of Crimean Tatar language.
Yes, for a lot of like especially probably in America is not as prevalent because while there are a little bit of a dialects in US like accents and so on, but I think for a lot of people it's a little bit wild to know that there's big difference in language. But then again, if you look something like Nordics, like if you go into Norway, for example, in Norway there might be different cities that are nearby, but they speak wildly different languages. It's actually very interesting to know that even in a culture that supposedly is so secluded in a one small area in the world, relatively, it's still so rich and diverse that there's even different dialects within the culture. It's very nice to hear. And I'm actually particularly interested in a very specific aspect, which I'm very makes me happy that it was specifically you that came, because I know that there are some well-known Crimean Tatar activists. Some of them, the representatives of Mejlis and so on. But I think one question that stood out for me the most is the younger generation perspective. How does the generation that is now growing up in this occupation sees it? People that had to learn history by Russian books, had to be introduced to the facts about the world through the prism of the occupying power. How is the youngest generation seeing all of that? How are they getting through this?
In Crimea, it's very difficult because for the past 9 years, like a new generation of children grew up, and they grew up studying Russian history books, and they grew up without a right to have Crimean Tatar identity. So we have to deal with it after the occupation of Crimea. But Crimean Tatars that live right now in Ukraine or abroad, like we see that Russia has not changed at all, and that they are trying to destroy our nation again. So the least that we can do now is to spread the truth and to tell the world what is going on in Crimea with our people. This is what the young generation of Crimean Tatars are doing abroad and in Ukraine.
So are you trying? Are you trying to establish more relationship with world communities?
Yes, right now I'm trying to spread the knowledge about the Crimean Tatars to foreigners
So
and to
okay, so
fight.
can people where can people get more information? Because it's going to be somewhat a short video. It's more about the introduction as a pitch. Not the best interviewer in the world. For that, you probably would need to talk with Jonathan from Silicon Curtain. He's absolutely amazing. But what else? People, where can people find more information about everything?
Honestly, there are many Russian myths about the origin of Crimean Tatars and in general about Crimea and Crimean Tatars. So it's important um, to spread the truth. And I think that the international community at least need to know about us and also help us to spread the truth and fight. So I think that it's important to note that the Crimean Tatars formed as a nation on the Crimean Peninsula, and they are the ancestors of many peoples who lived in Crimea throughout different historical periods. Because, for example, Russians say all the time that Crimean Tatars they came to Crimea from Asia or from Tatarstan, but it's a lie. It's not. It's a lie, and we have to understand it. Also, Crimean Tatars, they shouldn't be confused with the Tatars because they are two distinct peoples with distinct cultures, and their genesis occurred in distinct and independent ways. Um, so I wish foreigners think Crimea with its indigenous peoples, the Crimean Tatars, Karaites, and Krimchaks. We have also indigenous people who are Karaites and Krimchaks of Jewish origin. And I think that Crimea has its own culture and history that is worth remembering, learning about, and understanding.
Then I have kind of like a little bit of finalizing question, and then the floor is yours just to wrap it all up. Which is on this channel and specifically in my community, and I know communities of other YouTube creators maybe that don't like my style of videos, but are still trying to support Ukraine. A lot of times, questions of Crimean Tatars being absent, and we're just tying to Ukraine. But what else? People, not just international community, where we're talking about politicians, where we're talking about people with big important jobs, but what normal people can do to help the efforts that you mentioned that needs to be promoting for Crimean Tatars? How would people contribute to it? Is there a way how they can help out, something that they can do?
I think that at least, like the international community, foreigners, they need to know about our existence as the indigenous people of Crimea, as I've already said, and help us to spread the truth and fight the Russian propaganda because it's very important for us.
Can you give us like short, simple messages of the Russian propaganda? Because people might not realize when they're hearing something from the Russian propaganda, they might not realize it's Russian propaganda
About
because
Crimean
it just
Tatars.
sounds logical for them and they don't know the
Okay,
subject. So, what would be the couple of examples that you could put forward?
so for example, Russians say that Crimea has always been Russian and Russians always lived in Crimea, and this is sort of the Russian propaganda because we know that before the first occupation of Crimea by Russia in 1783, there were 0% of Russian people living in Crimea. This is the Russian propaganda number one. Secondly, they always say that Crimean Tatars they cannot be indigenous people of Crimea because we came to Crimea from Asia. This is another lie because, as I've already said, we were formed in Crimea as a nation, and this makes us indigenous to this land.
Yeah, it's a good example. I always find the example of origins of people in specific territories extremely stupid. because we all trace our origins to Africa. So what does that mean? What does that mean then?
Yeah, another Russian propaganda, they say that before Crimean Tatars, there were Greeks in Crimea, and that Greeks can be indigenous people of Crimea, but it's another lie because Greeks they have their own national state and they colonized Crimea. So and also one part, some part of Greeks they formed a modern Crimean Tatar nation.
But thank you so much, Leah. Would there be any last words for how people can follow up with you? Like any social networks you're using, any additional sound bites, reading notes that you would like to share? If you'll share them later, I can add them in a video comment for sure.
I use Instagram account and Twitter for spreading the culture and history of the Crimean Tatar people. In Instagram, it's called Crimea Comeback, and in Twitter, I don't know. Like you can just mention below.
Yes, obviously, all the links that you mentioned will be down in the descriptions. Thank you so much for this short introduction. It's going to be absolutely amazing knowing what we're going to have. I'm going to follow up with you if people will have additional questions, and we're going to do a follow up session where, as history and my experience on these media platforms have shown, the second time around is usually the best because people already get a little bit more comfortable, and then the discussion just flows a little bit past beyond the initial questions. Thank you so much, Leah, for your time. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
so
much,
much.
guys, for watching. And Slava Ukraini. And I don't know, do you
Heroям
have a saying
slava.
in Ukrainian?
Heroям slava.
Heroes Slava.
In Crimean Tatar language, we also have a slogan, which is Vatan, Millet, Kırım, and
Vatan
it
milletleri.
means homeland, nation, and Crimea.
Perfect. Such a great way to end it. Thank you so much for watching. See you guys.